So I imagine that many of you have been watching and actively participating in the Summer Olympics 2016 being held down in Rio de Janeiro. And you know, some of you have, and there's a chance some or many of you in here haven't. Maybe it's just not your cup of tea. Maybe you haven't had the time or the availability to get to watch and to participate in some of the Olympics. But either way, whether you have or you haven't, they end tonight. Tonight is the final day. Tonight is when it all comes to one grand culmination, and it will be over. And I really don't know how much you think about those athletes, but have you ever thought about what it looks like when it's over? When it's all said and done. Take, for instance, without a shadow of a doubt, the world's fastest man. His name is Usain Bolt, and he has run in the last 3 Olympics. If you did not know, he has competed in 9 final races over 3 years. 3 races each year. And in those 9 races, he has 9 gold medals. He is a 9 for 9, perfect 100% score. And there is no doubt that he is the world's fastest man right now. So what does he do? What do athletes do when they reach the pinnacle of success? When everything that they've ever wanted, everything they've ever dreamed about, everything that they've ever hoped for comes true, right? Well, there's a couple of different avenues that most athletes take when the Olympics are over. Many of them, like many of you in this room would do, I imagine, many of them kind of learn to set some of those disciplines and those habits that got them to that place. They kind of set those aside. You know, the 4 o'clock, 3-hour runs and the extremely healthy and strict diets that they do and the sleep patterns that they create, that the lifestyle habits that cause them to have to give up a lot of their life in order to be a superstar, to be a world-class athlete. Most athletes, when they reach that pinnacle of success, they just kind of let those things fall by the wayside. Some athletes, though, do the exact opposite. They learn that type of lifestyle, those disciplines and those habits, and they ultimately end up turning those disciplines and habits into success in another part of the world. Many world-class athletes, once they reach success, they turn those habits and they become world-class businessmen or businesswomen. They become public speakers and encouragements, and they turn their success on the field or on the track into success elsewhere in life. Those are kind of the 2 main options of what the athletes do. The question is, what do you do? What do you do when you reach that success? When you get to that thing that you've been dreaming for all of your life or for a long portion of your life? Maybe it's that perfect job that you finally achieved and that you attained, that you've been working so hard for. Maybe it's you've had this idea and dream to buy or build the perfect home. And you've been working all your life and you finally reached that goal. Or maybe you have always wanted to be educated, and so you had this dream of the perfect education, and one day you get to that level and you achieve that diploma or diplomas. Or maybe it's none of those things. Maybe it's something different. Maybe your goal and dream is to just get all the kids out of the house. And when all the kids are finally gone, that there's a weight off your shoulder and you can finally breathe again. Or maybe it's when all of your kids collectively have college diplomas hanging on their wall, and you would call that the greatest success you could ever reach. Or for many people, it's that moment when that last child has finally entered into a marriage relationship, potentially, and all your kids are married and kind of outside your responsibility and are growing their kind of relationships and their families. Maybe that's the goal and the dream that you've always looked forward to? What do you do when you reach that point of success in your life that you've been dreaming and trying so hard for? Believe it or not, God's Word speaks directly to this thing. And so today, if you'll start turning there, we are going to look at the life of Gideon, and we're going to look at a specific portion of his story from Judges chapter 8. And so, as you start to turn to Judges chapter 8, I need to tell you a little bit about this success that Gideon achieved. You see, Gideon was a warrior, or is going to be a judge over these people, over Israel. And God, through Gideon, God is going to do something absolutely amazing. God is ultimately going to prepare him to lead an army against a group of really bad people known as the Midianites. This is actually the guy we talked about a couple of weeks ago in Judges chapter 6, when we talked about the journey of faith being hard and being difficult. And so he follows this journey of faith, and ultimately God whittles and whittles and whittles his army down to roughly 300 people. Those 300 people are going to battle against thousands of the Midianites, and ultimately with torches in their right hand and with these ceramic type jars that were easily breakable in their left hand, they would surround the Midianites one evening up high on a hill, and they would ultimately blow a trumpet. A group of the Israelites would blow their trumpet, and it would wake all the Midianites up, and then they would hold their torches up as a light, and then ultimately they would crack those jars, and it would make this crazy loud sound. And 300 people from highly elevated would scare the living daylights out of these Midianites. And they would be so scared that they would run away crying, willing to give up everything. And ultimately, it was the Lord who did a miraculous thing. It was the Lord, like your life, when he shows up, steps onto the scene and does something miraculous in your life. You're a man or a woman of limited resources. Gideon was a man who was leading a group of people with a limited number of resources. You see, Proverbs says that the horse is prepared for battle, but victory belongs to the Lord. And this was evident in this case. Victory belonged to the Lord. And we're going to pick up the story in Judges chapter 8 where it's kind of all said and done. And he has won the victory. He has achieved by far the greatest accomplishment of his life. And Gideon is going to respond. He's going to do some good things as he responds. And he's going to do some bad things. And then we're going to see what it all really means. So today I want you to follow with me as we talk about the good that he does in his response. I want you to see the bad things that he does as he responds. And I want you to really think about why it all even matters. So turn with me to Judges chapter 8. And Gideon's response begins in chapter 8, verse 22. Verse 22 says, "The Israelites said to Gideon, 'Please, please rule over us, you and your son and your grandsons, because you have saved us from the hands of Midian.'" You see, when you do good things, the world is going to take notice. When you reach those diplomas, when you build those houses, when you gain those great jobs, the world is going to see that. The question is, what are you going to do when the world sees that? Because that is what's very important. Keep in mind here, he has the chance to set his family up for a lifetime. Will you rule over us? And when you're done, when you're no longer here, we want your sons and we want your grandsons. I imagine many of you in here, if somebody gave you the opportunity and said, Your kids and your grandkids are set for life if you will allow it. Many of you would probably say, sounds good to me. You see, prosperity for our families is a big deal. But listen to the good response that Gideon makes. But Gideon told them in verse 23, No, no, I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. But instead, the Lord will rule over you. You see, Gideon knew a characteristic that you and I struggle with very deeply. He knew something of very great importance. It's not hard, but it is hard to do. Gideon knew how to turn or redirect the praise of men into praise for God. You see, when people notice you're doing good, when people notice that you have a lot of good things and they say, wow, will you do this, or will you lead, or will you be our guy? And you say, well, of course I will, because look how good, look how strong, look how smart I am. That ultimately is a bad response. But instead, Gideon knows how to say, listen, it's not about me ruling over you. It's not about my sons or my grandsons ruling over you, because listen, we are only instruments of God's goodness and grace in the life of our people. But instead, we desire that the Lord rule over you. You see, we have to put our pride down, and we have to realize that the Lord is in control. And we have to be people who redirect the praise of men and redirect it to the praise of God. That's what Gideon did. You see, Gideon was this kind of guy who would lead from a platform of saying, in the past, Judges chapter 6, remember that time when we had no idea what to even do? God was faithful to prepare us. He's the one who whittled us down and got us ready. And then ultimately, not only was God faithful to prepare us for battle, but God actually took us into battle and He won it for us. There's no doubt that 300 people could defeat this size of the Midianites. There was no doubt. They didn't even have ammunition or weapons. It was all the Lord. He was faithful then. He's faithful today. And Gideon is saying, listen, I can't rule over you because it's the Lord. He was faithful then. He's faithful today. And He will be faithful in the future. Gideon was a good leader at this time in what he was saying. And it's important that we, as people are looking up to us, as people are looking for your influence in their life, that we redirect the praise of men and we turn it into praise for God, who has been good in our lives. You see, there's a lot of pictures from the 2016 Summer Olympics, and there's a lot of memorable moments. One of the most memorable moments for me happened about a week and a half ago. It even had to do with a sport that really isn't even that flashy. It has to do with the U.S. men's synchronized diving team. And you see these two men, their names were Dave Boudier and Steele Johnson, and they did the very best that they possibly could. And they ended up winning the silver medal in the final competition. And immediately after, they're pulled out of the water, and they hadn't even dried off yet. And the reporter comes to them and sticks the microphone in front of their face and begins to just interview them. Seconds after they had just won the silver medal, they had just achieved everything they could have ever possibly hoped for. And as the interview goes on, it's about 60 seconds. It's on the internet, and I highly suggest you listen to it. But the reporter says, "How in the world can you do what you just did?" And without a shadow of a doubt, they both immediately say, "Because we know, or we knew, and we are confident that our identity is in Christ. That we are divers and we work hard and we do the very best we could, but whether we fail or whether we win, it's all going to be for Him because our identity is in Jesus Christ." A minute and a half of reporting. And it was probably one of the most impactful times in the 2016 Summer Olympics because these men knew how to take the praise of how well that they had done and all the hard work that they had put into it. There was no doubt. And they redirected that praise right off the bat and said, it's not about me. It's all about Jesus. Because without him, I can't do anything. And with him, I'm either going to fail or I'm going to succeed, but it's all going to be for him. And that is what it looks like when you succeed. That's what Gideon did. It was very impactful. So not only does Gideon do something good, but look at what he does. It's bad. Just keep following. Chapter 8, very next verse. The very next word says, and he said. Judges 8:24. Not a good verse to want to be excited about. Because you see, Gideon never knew when to be quiet. Gideon, like most of you in this room, and myself included, never knew when to just shut your mouth and to be quiet. If you're anything like me, you know exactly what he's about to do and how he's about to make a mistake. Judges chapter 8, verse 24. And Gideon said, well, actually, I do have one request. That each of you give me an earring from your share of the plunder. You see, it was the custom of the Ishmaelites to wear gold earrings. And so they answered, oh, we will be so glad to give you them. So they spread out a garment, and each man threw a ring from the plunder into it. And the weight of the gold rings he asked for came to about 1,700 shekels. That was a lot. Not counting the ornaments, nor the pendants, nor the purple garments worn by the kings of the Midianites, or the chains that were on the camels' necks. You see, Gideon made the gold into an ephod, which he placed in Ophrah, his town. You see, Gideon's request would ultimately, his lack of being able to be quiet and to let the story kind of fizz, let the story kind of settle, his last request is ultimately going to turn into idol worship for the Israelites. You see, the first commandment that God gives his people in order to rightly relate with him is, thou shalt not have any other gods before me. I am the one true God. Nothing else matters. I am it. You will worship me and worship me alone. You can see the Ten Commandments around this building. This is how God calls his people to relate to him. And what happens? Out of potentially good motives, Gideon creates an opportunity for the Israelites to worship an idol. You see, an ephod is known as a fine linen garment that was made up of all of these nice jewels that the priest would wear. And when he had this linen garment made, what ultimately would occur is that the Israelites would ultimately end up worshiping two things other than God. They would ultimately end up worshiping the success that they had received. All the jewels, all the flashy stuff, all the gold, all the pendants. When that was made and they would worship that, they were worshiping the success that God had placed in their life. You see, for you and me, God blesses you with great jobs. He blesses you with great skills and great talents and great things. And you and I often worship the things that God gives us in our life than worshiping God himself. And not only that, this ephod was worn specifically by the priest. And so when they would worship or when they would look at this, they would ultimately worship the things that God had blessed him with, but ultimately they would worship the priest or Gideon himself. Because when they would see that, they would see Gideon wearing this, looking good, and all that they would remember was how Gideon led them in a mighty way. And instead, they would forget that God was in control and that God himself was good. and they would worship the things that God gave them, and they would worship the priest or Gideon himself instead of worshiping the Lord. You see, there's a couple words I want you to pick up on. Go to 27b where we left off. Listen to what it says. All of Israel, every single Israelite, prostituted themselves. Now, don't be fooled. The word prostituted here is not an evil term. It's not a bad term. It's just a simple term that they would use as defined of laying themselves down. This was not selling themselves for cheap or however you may think of that word. This is a word that just said they laid themselves down. And so listen to what it says. It says they prostituted themselves by worshiping it, the ephod that Gideon has requested. So what they would do is they would lay all of their body down as a symbol of reverence. But instead of worshiping and laying all of their life down to the Lord, they would very quickly lay their life down, which is the greatest act of worship that you and I could ever do, and they would prostitute themselves, lay with their face to the ground, and they would worship the success that the Lord had given them. And you want to know how I know it was a bad thing? Look at the very next few words. They prostituted themselves by worshiping it there, and it, the success, the ephod that we're talking about, became a snare to Gideon and to his family. You see, the thing that Gideon would request, the thing that Gideon would say, all I need is one thing from you, maybe a good motive, would ultimately be the death and the deadly trap for he and all of his family. All because he couldn't keep his mouth shut. You see, we got the good, we got the bad, and then we got everything else. What does it all mean? Listen as I read the end of the story. Judges chapter 8, verse 28. Thus Midian, the Midianites, was subdued before the Israelites, and they did not even raise its head again during Gideon's lifetime. The land enjoyed peace for 40 years. You see, what happened is Gideon and the Israelites, they won the battle. You know, they defeated Midian. They defeated all the Midianites. They weren't ever a problem, ever again. They won the battle. They achieved exactly what they wanted. They were successful. And for 40 years, they found peace. And for you in your lifetime, you may be looking at your life and saying, listen, I have won the battle. I have done the things that I've wanted to do. I've reached the success I've wanted to reach. But the question is, if you've won the battle, that's good. The question is, have you won the war? You see, there's a lot of battles, but ultimately there's only one war. And I want you to look at what happens. Starting in verse 29. Jerubbaal, son of Joash, went back home to live, and he had 70 sons of his own, for he had many wives. His concubine, who lived in Shechem, also bore him a son, whose name was Abimelech. Gideon, son of Joash, he died at a good old age. I don't know what a good old age is, but this is good old age here. So if you ever wondered, there is good old age. He died at a good old age, and he was buried in the tomb of his father, Joash of Orpha of the Abizarites. And look, underline it, highlight it, whatever you got. Look at verse 33. After 40 years of success, after 40 years of peace, Gideon dies, good old age. And Judges 8:33 says, no sooner had Gideon died than the Israelites again prostituted themselves to Baal. They would ultimately set up Baal worship. They would ultimately do everything that the Lord said, don't do. And this is ultimately one of the downturns in the book of Judges. And it will down spiral, and it will keep going down forever. And it will get very dark in the land and the idea of the Israelite people. You see, you can win all of the battles you can fight, but the truth is, are you winning the war? I want you to think about it like this. I want you to think fictitiously of a man who owned and built and created something similar to maybe the Coca-Cola product. Some of you drink a little bit of Coca-Cola in this room. I've always enjoyed a good cold Coca-Cola. I want you to think about that man. He has created this product, and all of his life, every family get-together, every friendly outing on the back porch, everywhere he goes, he always has a cooler of Coca-Cola, and everything he does, he tries to get his family and his kids and his grandkids, and he makes sure that they drink nothing but Coca-Cola. That's all that's allowed. There is nothing else. There is no other drinks out there. And then one day, after many years of many family gatherings, of many family get-togethers and friendly times, of him making sure that everybody drinks only Coca-Cola, the old man dies. And they all come to the church, and they all file in, and the man's casket's down at the front of the church, and they do a funeral for this man, and ultimately they take his casket, they move it outside the church, and they walk it across the street to the cemetery. They lay the man into the ground, and then, like any good people do, they go to the cafe, and they get themselves something to eat. In honor, of course, of this man and his life, and they sit down. The menus come out, the waitress comes to the table, and after years and years and years of this man doing nothing but pushing Coca-Cola on their life, they never even had another choice. The waitress says, "What would you like to drink today?" And unfortunately, before any time elapses, everybody at the table says, "I'd like a good, cold Dr. Pepper." And you see, that's a lot of what happens in our life. We have a lot of people in the younger generations who all their life they've been drugged to church. They've been beat over the Bible or over their heads with the Bible. They've been told everything they're doing wrong and how to do it right. And we've had men and women who've tried to lead them by forcing them to do what it is they should be doing. And people are dying believing that they've won the battle. They've gotten their kids in church every single Sunday. They've made their kids come to Sunday school all their life growing up. But believe it or not, 90% of kids who go off to college will say, "You know what? I kind of have a drug problem. I've been drugged to church all my life, and now I really don't want to go anymore." And so 90% of young people who potentially grew up in the church, right? They ultimately end up falling away from the church. And then they're raising families outside of the church. And the whole idea is this. You can win the battle, and you can mandate that your family and everybody do exactly what you tell them to do. And they may, just out of respect, do it. But the real war that you need to win is, what are the people whom you're leading, who are looking to you, what are they going to do when you pass away? What kind of legacy are you really leaving for your family and for your friends? Is it like Gideon, who they enjoyed 40 years of success and prosperity? And no sooner had Gideon passed away, no sooner had they laid him in the grave, that all of Israel became worshipers of Baal. May that not be the case for your family and for your friends. Because God not only wants you to win the battle, but God wants you to win the war. So the invitation that we're about to have is going to be twofold. The first part of the invitation is going to be this. Listen very closely. You can win all the battles in your life. You can achieve all kinds of success. But if you never place your faith in Jesus Christ and you never make Jesus the Lord of your life, you may win every battle, but you will lose the war. You will lose the eternal war. You will die. You will pass from this life into the next. And if your faith is not in Jesus, you will not spend eternity with the Father. And so first and foremost, I pray that us here today have decided the eternal war that really matters. That you are firm in the foundation that Jesus is the Lord of your life. And you place your faith and trust in Him, not in any works, not in anything else, not in this church, not in any good leaders, but in Jesus Christ Himself. And if you've done that, then secondly, I ask you, what do you do when you reach success in your life? Do you redirect praise back to God the Father? Because He's the one who's given you the success in your life. Ultimately, do you know when to shut your mouth when you find success? And will you win the battle? And remember that the battle is not everything. Will you win the war? Will you do whatever it takes so that your family and that your friends, when you pass from this life into the next, no sooner will you die one day of good old age, will you win that war, the war that really matters? Will you stand and sing with us today?